and I would like to pass the screen and the microphone to Samuel, whose GLO VirtYS project focused on the employment outcomes of trans individuals as compared to their cisgender counterparts. Please, Samuel.
Excellent. So, can everyone see the screen okay? Yeah. Oh.
Yes, we have just
Fantastic.
seen it, and then it was gone.
Can you see
Yes.
now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm Sam. I've been working with Drydakis on a project that has focused on the relationship between gender identity and employment and self-employment outcomes, and looking at the role that transgender focused legislation has on improving the labour market outcomes of transgender people in the US. So historically, within economics, much of the work has focused on gender taking very binary views. And while there's been a lot of work, there's been very little on transgender people, which is mainly due to a lack of data on whether or not people are transgender or cisgender, because generally the questions on transgender status just aren't included in survey data. So in this particular project, I make use of newly available data on the labour market outcomes of transgender people. And I also look at the role that transgender policy has had in reducing any negative gaps. So to say there has been some work, but it's been fairly limited. Some early work by James and his colleagues and by Lapel has generally documented that transgender people are more likely to live in poverty and that transgender people are around 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their cisgender counterparts. Some recent work by Carpenter using the same data that I use in this particular project has shown that transgender people are less likely to be college educated, have lower employment rates, lower household incomes, higher poverty rates, and worse self-rated health. And then within the experimental literature, there's been some work that has shown that transitioning from male to female or vice versa has an impact on earnings. Some early work made use of data from attendees of a transgender conference. And those findings have been replicated with administrative data on gender changes in the Netherlands. And then there's been a correspondence study that's recently been published that's shown that there is employer discrimination against transgender people in male-dominated occupations, and there's been some lab experiments that have shown evidence of both customer and co-worker discrimination in Belgium. In this particular project, I've contributed to literature in a few different ways. Firstly, a lot of the work that's been done comparing transgender to cisgender people has combined the entire cisgender population and then just included a dummy variable for being a cisgender female. Here I take a different approach, so I compare people based on their gender identity. So I compare, for example, female to male transgender people to cisgender males, and male to female transgender people to cisgender females. I also analyse the propensity to be self-employed for transgender people for the first time, and I look at the impact of 3 different trans-inclusive policies, so Employment Non-Discrimination Acts, Credit Non-Discrimination Acts, and Gender Identity Document laws on the transgender labour market outcomes for the first time. So just to give you some background on why I've been motivated to look at these particular areas that haven't been explored before. In terms of self-employment, a lot of work has kind of shown that people end up in self-employment because they're either pushed into it or pulled into it. And push factors refer to things like experience of discrimination or a lack of opportunities, or just experiences within traditional employment. Pull factors refer more generally to an anticipation of greater earnings or greater flexibility, etc., etc. And as a result, we expect that there might be marginalized groups might be more attracted to self-employment as a reflection of their experiences within more traditional employment settings. So here I look at whether or not transgender people are more attracted to self-employment as a reflection of push or pull factors, although I can't actually distinguish which of the two. In terms of the policies, so Employment Non-Discrimination Acts historically have been used across America and more generally across the globe to prevent discrimination occurring based on someone being a minority. So theoretically, they should prevent any employment gaps because they prevent discrimination in the hiring process, but there's been some work that's shown that's not always the case, as they can increase the costs associated with hiring and terminating employers from a protected group. So it might actually make issues worse for that protected group. Credit non-discrimination acts in the context of this project are particularly interesting because they reduce barriers to the capital needed to access self-employment. And there's been some work that has shown that self-employed people, especially at the beginning, do access credit to enable them to become self-employed. So preventing discrimination in the credit market should theoretically make it easier for transgender people that may have otherwise faced discrimination to access that credit needed to become self-employed. And then in terms of gender identity document laws, so in America, in some states, you are required to have surgical reassignment surgery to be able to change your gender marker on ID documents. And for you to be able to change your gender marker on your driving license, you also have to have the appropriate gender marker on your birth certificate. So in order to, we know that incongruent documents signal transgender status, because then when a potential employer sees incongruent documents, they can see that maybe the way that someone is presenting and their gender marker on their birth certificate, on their driving license, for example, is different. It highlights that someone is transgender. So it increases the likelihood of discrimination. So in America, there's 24 states that do not require sexual reassignment surgery or a court order, and I exploit changes in the removal of that requirement to look at the role of removing that on the labour market outcomes of transgender people. The data that I've used in the project comes from the Behavioural Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which has data on 35 states. And that's because there's 35 states that include the question, do you consider yourself to be transgender? Which is a question that's just included in very, very few survey data sets. Taking data from each of those states that include that question each year, I end up with a sample of around 600,000 cisgender people and around 2,500 transgender people. So it's quite a large sample size of transgender people, especially in comparison to a lot of the work that's been done and published in the past. In terms of the way that I approach analysing this, I use a simple OLS model. I will say that I do also rerun everything with a probit model, and the same kind of results came out. The same significance and the same qualitative patterns as well. But to look at the employment and self-employment differentials, I use a standard OLS model. I include a dummy variable for being transgender, and then I include a plethora of different individual and state level characteristics. So these include things like age, education status, race and ethnicity, etc. And I also include state level characteristics, that's each of the 3 different policies that I discussed. And it also includes the percentage of Republican voters by state and the GDP per capita by state. And then I also include both state and year fixed effects. And then in order to look at the impact of legislation, I just include an additional interaction between being transgender and then the specific law that I'm looking at. So going straight into results, firstly, I replicate the results that were presented by Carpenter in his 2020 paper, and I show that when we're comparing transgender people to the entire cisgender population with a dummy variable for being female, I find that transgender people are significantly less likely to be in employment, and this is largest for gender non-conforming transgender people. When I make the appropriate gender comparisons, I find that actually male to female transgender people are significantly more likely than cisgender females to be in employment. But for the remaining categories, it's a negative coefficient that we document. The male to female coefficient, obviously there might be a concern that it's driven by the higher likelihood of cisgender women having children. So as a result, I do re-estimate that particular model with only childless people, whether they're cisgender or trans. And I also include an interaction between being cisgender and having children, and the exact same qualitative significance are coming through. In terms of self-employment, I document again that male to female transgender people are more likely to be self-employed than cisgender females. And again, I do rerun that with a number of different specifications to analyse whether or not it's a lack of children or lower propensity to have children that is driving those results. And again, it doesn't seem to be that. And then I find that female to male transgender people are significantly less likely to be employed. But for gender non-conforming transgender people, there doesn't seem to be a significant relationship there. Going on to policy, in terms of the impact of the 3 different policies on the employment outcomes of transgender people, generally at an aggregate level, I find very little evidence that it's having a significant impact. The only particular specification that has an impact is for gender non-conforming males. And for that group, I find that the removal of surgical requirements to change gender on birth certificate is associated with a lower propensity to be employed. And that's likely coming through because in a lot of states where sexual reassignment surgery isn't required, people are also able to include an X mark rather than male or female. So again, it's highlighting to employers that gender non-conforming people are gender non-conforming or non-binary. So it's highlighting the transgender status and increasing the likelihood potentially of discrimination. In terms of self-employment, again, I find very little evidence. There's an effect at the aggregate level. The only impact that I find is for gender non-conforming females, and I find that Employment Non-Discrimination Acts have a significant negative impact on the self-employment of gender non-conforming females, which might be due to them moving into other areas such as employment, because they're assuming that there's going to be a lower likelihood of discrimination as a reflect of the introduction of those acts. So the next thing that I was really interested in was looking at the impact of these legislations on groups that we know might face a double discrimination within the labour market. So we know that people that are non-white, people that are older, and people that are non-college graduates are more likely to face worse labour market outcomes anyway. So I wanted to see whether or not the different legislations are having a greater impact on those particular groups of transgender workers. So to do that, I just included an additional interaction between the additional minority status, being transgender, and the policy of interest. And I find that when we do look at this, there is actually some interesting results, and I find some significance, and I find that they're having quite large and significant impacts on certain minority groups. So in terms of Employment Non-Discrimination Acts, I find that they significantly increase the likelihood of male to female transgender people that are older or that are non-college graduates on being employed. In terms of the impact of removal of sexual reassignment surgery requirements, again, for the exact same groups, that's for older and non-college educated male to female transgender people, I find significant and positive impacts. I did also rerun this for Credit Non-Discrimination Acts. There's nothing really significant in it, and due to time constraints, I've just limited it to the ones where there's an interest in significant finding. In terms of Credit Non-Discrimination Acts for self-employment, however, I do find significant impacts. I find that older male to female and older gender non-conforming female transgender people are significantly more likely to be employed after the introduction of the Credit Non-Discrimination Act. So, to kind of bring it to a close, I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions. Similar to Carpenter, I've demonstrated that transgender people are less likely to be employed in the labour market, except perhaps for male to female transgender people who, in comparison to cisgender females, are more likely to be employed. I document a negative self-employment differential between female to male and cisgender people, and I document a positive self-employment differential between transgender women, so that's male to female, and cisgender women, which may be related to either push or pull factors, but in the present work I can't look at which one of those two is important. At the aggregate level, trans-inclusive policies are observed as not having a significant impact on the employment or self-employment of transgender people, but the results are, when I look at subpopulations, highlights the importance of doing so. So I find that transgender progressive legislation does have important positive impacts, especially for those transgender groups that are more likely to face worse labour market outcomes, and especially for older transgender people. So this finding highlights the important role of trans legislation on the labour market outcomes of trans people, but for the first time it highlights the detrimental economic impact of surgical requirements or surgical reassignment surgeries as a requirement to be able to change gender markers on ID documents. This is an ongoing project. I'm still working on this now. I'm still looking at ways that I can extend the project and different ways of looking at things and different kind of clever things to do. So any feedback or advice would be greatly appreciated, but I do thank you for your time for listening.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Well on time. Are there questions to Samuel? If you do have a question, just unmute yourself and let us know. Please, Almas.
Were you able to control whether, if they have employment, is the same as before and after or not? I would guess if they had employment that was secure before the transition, very unlikely they would be discriminated or less discriminated compared with those that they didn't have a stable employment before the transgender action.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. I definitely think that's the case. Due to data constraints, annoyingly, the BRFSS is cross-sectional in nature. So I don't have information on employment status from previous years.
Okay.
Obviously, if I could get panel data, I'd love to look at that. But it's just, there's such a lack of data that's including gender identity as a question, which is annoying.
But you control for age, right?
Yeah, so I control
That could be
for
one
age
part
and
of it.
education. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Please, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering, do you have information in your paper on what the timing of, and about these policies across the states, and if there's a pattern? I'm thinking about exogeneity, and what's the timing of these different policies? Which states have them in place, and when? I didn't know if there's a I and a T factor there.
Yeah, so I do have quite good variation, luckily, across the period, which is quite lucky considering it's only kind of 4 years. But I've got about 8 to 10 states for each different policy. In terms of, there is a section in the paper, I do plan on expanding on it a little bit more in the paper, but the states that seem to introduce these laws as well don't seem to reflect necessarily views towards transgender people within states. So I think one of the first states to remove sexual reassignment surgery was Alaska. And New York only removed sexual reassignment surgery this year. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be driven by that. I do know as well that I need to kind of show some kind of, at least something to suggest that it's not pre-trans. So I am planning on doing some kind of event study, but that's just not completed yet. So I've not included that this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? I'd like to ask a question. Just given the number of the transgender people compared to the overall population, I mean, overall sample, have you considered some sort of matching techniques to use to kind of refine the strategy? Because I'm a little bit, just from the econometrics perspective, I'm a little bit concerned. I would like to see kind of some more similar comparison to what to the characteristics that these people have.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea. That's not something I'd considered, but it's something I can probably fairly easily include. So yeah, I'll have a look into PSM and including that as part of the econometric setup.
Okay, thank you. Well, it looks like there.
Sorry.
Please, Matlo.
I don't have a,
yes.
I was just waiting for people to have specific question about the paper, because I don't really have a question about the paper. I was just thinking about the two papers presented today, and I was just thinking in the next kind of project, as you said, the project is ongoing. There could be a connection between the previous paper that was presented today and your paper, because here you're just looking, obviously, employment or unemployment, whatever, discrimination. But in terms of those who do get employment, what kind of jobs they are getting, and kind of, you know, the mismatch angle that was explored earlier on. Are transgender people more mismatched than non-transgender people? And you know, so some kind of exploring in terms of what kind of jobs people are getting, and how much they commensurate with their, let's say, education, and what type of education and stuff.
Yeah, I think it would be super interesting.
Yeah. So as a GLO, which is a network of research fellows and affiliates, I think the networking of the two presenters today would be a great advertising thing for us as well, in addition to the fact that it will be a really interesting paper. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and to Samuel and Yanis for sharing their insight and expertise with us. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact Samuel or Yanis, or if you have questions about the GLO VirtYS program, all our contacts are on the GLO website. And I would like just to mention quickly that we have extended the deadline for the second cohort. So if you have someone who may be interested and eligible to apply, please share this information with them. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
Bye.